Good morning, everyone. Can we please give another round of applause to the incredible Brooklyn Interdenominational Choir? Thank you. I'm Katie Clark. I'm the president of BAM. And on behalf of the BAM staff and trustees, I'm so pleased to welcome you all to the 34th annual tribute to the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. As always, I want to thank our partners in bringing this program to you, Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams and Medgar Evers College of the City University of New York, and its president and BAM trustee, Dr. Rudy Crew. Thank you. And it would not be a BAM celebration on this day without incredible artists. So in addition to the chorus, the incredible Son Little will be performing later in the program. And at 1 o'clock, please join us for a free screening of Amazing Grace, the concert film about Aretha Franklin's iconic 1972 gospel album. It's terrific. It's an amazing movie. And I urge you all to visit the DeVitri Lounge right outside the auditorium for Picture the Dream, where our young people explore their appreciation of Dr. King's message through visual art. We honor Dr. King every year, but we follow his principles every day when we stand up for the marginalized, the oppressed, and the voiceless. We follow his example when we call out injustice by its name and demand that civil liberties are the birthright of everyone, not just a privileged few. And we remember his discipline and sacrifice when we go to the ballot box and hold our elected officials to the highest standards. Big year for that. Today we celebrate a great, great leader and joyously praise his legacy. I am so pleased to introduce our borough president, Eric Adams, a proud son of Brooklyn. Eric is a retired captain of the New York Police Department, having served in law enforcement for more than 20 years. He is a former New York State Senator and a tireless fighter for his home and his neighbors. Please welcome Brooklyn's Borough President, Eric Adams.
One of the most impactful things about Dr. King is that he did not allow us to be in a place of comfort. There were things that were happening across the entire country, and many people did not want Dr. King and the others who were part of the movement of change to move them from the place of discomfort. And you're often criticized during current times when you don't just stay in comfort. I remember my years as the founder of 100 Blacks in Law Enforcement Who Care, and I had the audacity to talk about stop and frisk and how pervasive it was in alienating communities. Editorial boards would attack and criticize me, but I did not want us to be in comfort while black boys across this city were being criminalized and stigmatized. And so when I raise these issues, it is not out of being mean. It is out of remembering what Dr. King was and continued to be about. And so let me talk about one item. Definitions are so important. In America, the definition of crisis is anything of a major threat or danger that does not take place in communities of color. When we had 9mm bullets carving highways of death through our communities and young men of color were dying at a disproportionate rate, it was an incident. When AK-47s and assault rifles found their place in the suburban counties, which was wrong, it became a crisis, and federal government and state government passed legislation to deal with the threat of assault weapons. The gun crisis in America is not assault weapons, they are handguns, but the victims of them are black and brown people who are considered dispensable, and that's why you don't see the urgency of the matter. It's not considered a crisis. Go to the south side of Chicago and see the number of children that are dying daily. Go to Compton, Liberty City, Brownsville. All across America, handguns is carving highways of death. Even when the bullet hits the body of a person, it continues to travel and rips the anatomy of the communities apart and traumatizes the people, but it is not considered a crisis. When crack was all over this country, from South Jamaica, Queens, all through California, all through Mississippi, you had crack vials on every street corner, children seeing it in their communities, finding dead bodies. It was just an incident. But when opioid went to other areas, we saw governments rise up and say we must deal with this crisis. Go look at the educational numbers. We don't have an educational problem in the city, in this country. We have a black and brown boys' educational problem. Look at the level ones all over this country. Either black and brown boys are born with the inability to comprehend information, or we've created an educational system that can't figure out how to educate them, or the process is we don't want to educate them. Trust me, folks, if other communities were failing, every year there would be riots in the street to improve our educational system. How do you spend $27 billion a year and you can't educate our children at the capacity that they deserve to be educated? And when you don't educate, you're creating a pipeline to incarceration. 80% of the black men and women at Rikers Island don't have a high school diploma, equivalency diploma. A third of the 18-year-olds read below a 5th grade reading level. And if you look at the number of those who are dyslexic, 30 to 40%, over 55% have a learning disability. It's not about closing the building of Rikers, it's about closing the pipeline that feeds Rikers. But it has to be a crisis. And let me drop this on you. This is blowing my mind. So a group of mothers come to my office, and they're showing bite marks from rats. Waking up in the middle of the night, seeing rats in their babies' bedpans. Open the closet doors, the rats are running out in NYCHA. And they came to me and they said, we're traumatized, Eric, over rat infestation. And I had the audacity to seek across this country to find, do we have a way to deal with this crisis? And we come up with a device, and we killed 107 rats at Borough. And so we said we're going to expand it out. And a group of folks come out and say, how dare you kill these rats? So you have to interpret the conversation. You are saying, in essence, these precious rodents are more important than the babies in our community. Because to those mothers, watching their children being bit by rodents and traumatized. It was a crisis. But to those who saw the rodents were more important, it was just an incident. We govern in the mode that what happens in black and brown communities is just some simple incidents, and it's not a crisis. And I'm unapologetic about the reality that the people who know what they're going through every day. That's what Dr. King was about. That's what that letter was from the Birmingham jail. That's what it was. You're telling us to wait. You're telling us to be patient. That's what the marches was about. That's what happened down in the South when little babies refused to stay in their classrooms and ripped the gates off the building to march in the street. They knew it was a crisis. That's what was happening in Soweto, South Africa, when young children said, I don't want to live under apartheid anymore. I want to be free. We are in a crisis. Black and brown people are being pushed out of the borough that they made possible in the first place. You were here long before Starbucks. The popularity of the brand must turn into prosperity for every man and woman in this borough. The gap in inequality is expanding at an unbelievable rate. Our seniors no longer feel they have a right here. The creativity that is needed to make sure we have a home here in the borough of the people who made this borough what it is. You were waking up to gunshots and not alarm clocks, but you stayed. Long before BAM in this area was a fancy and beautiful place, there used to be a homeless hotel right on the corner. Yeah, you know what? And I know, listen, you uncomfortable. He made folks uncomfortable too. That's right. And listen, they're gonna talk about me. But I've been talked about before. I'm clear on this mission that we're on. So this meeting that we have here today, this is to reignite our spirit. This is to put us on the mission. 2020 is the year of clear vision. And so let me conclude with this. Don't think for one moment that the lights are that bright that I don't notice those of you who are not clapping. I got it. I'm tired of the increase in hate crimes. I'm tired of my Jewish brothers and sisters walking down the block, and when you attack a Hasidic person, you're not only attacking a Hasidic person, it's a symbol of Judaism in this city because people identify them. I'm tired of my LGBTQ community is being attacked merely for being gay and beaten in our streets and abused. I'm tired of the increase of different groups that are being targeted. So what we're doing an initiative called Breaking Bread, Building Bonds. 100 dinners all over the city, 10 people at each dinner. Each one of the individuals at the table will come from another ethnic group or lifestyle or culture. We have to talk to each other, folks. We have to stop kidding ourselves. We need to know why someone wears a hijab, a yarmulke, a kufi, what it means to wear a turban, what it means to come from a different place in a different location. We have to communicate. It's not about Facebook, it's face-to-face interaction. It's not about my space, it's about sharing our space. It's not Instagram, it's about having long-term communications with each other. We held one in Queens yesterday around the table with men and women from different groups, and they started to learn about each other. We have tough times ahead of us. We can't do it by pointing and demonizing each other. We in this together, if we like it or not. We need to build together and be about what Dr. King was about. It's not just a conversation, it's about a destination of how do we live in the city together. One people in the city. That's why we say one Brooklyn. It's about one people. Don't stop pointing fingers. Don't stop talking about, I hate this one, I like this one. No, we are in this together, like it or not. Like it or not. That's what we must do. Let's sit down, let's talk. 47% of Brooklynites speak a language other than English at home. The real classroom is not in the sterilized environment of a classroom building. It is in our communities. Let's get out. Let's explore each other. Let's go to a different restaurant, a different community. Let's create an environment where we show the globe how to do it in the right way. And it's going to be discomforting, but growth is in discomfort. That is what this is about. And so, let's be king-like. Let's move from the place where many of us are. Let's continue to grow. And let's continue to make this a place where we can raise healthy children and families. I love you. I respect you. I thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce our MC for today. As the New York City Council member for the 36th District, Robert Carnegie represents the people of Bedford-Stuyvesant and Crown Heights. In just 4 years, he has passed legislation in almost every committee on which he has served. Robert appointed the first Director of Arts and Culture in the Council and has been a great supporter of BAM and the arts institutions in New York City. Please welcome Council member Robert Carnegie.
Good morning, Brooklyn. So I always start by making sure that I can feel comfortable in the room, so I need my people. So is Bed-Stuy in the house? Is Crown Heights in the house? So generally I get in trouble right here because I can't name every particular section, but is Brooklyn in the house? So 8 men or women thoroughly immersed in the true spirit of social justice are a far greater asset than 80 with lukewarm enthusiasm. Do thy duty that is best, we leave unto the Lord the rest. Thanks to our Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams, Medgar College, and the Brooklyn Academy of Music for hosting the 34th annual Brooklyn Tribute to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And thanks to all of you for joining us to lift up the life and legacy of Dr. King. One of the many benefits of this day is the opportunity to re-engage with Dr. King's life and with his legacy. An element of Dr. King's unique genius was his ability to convey in a flash truly profound ideas as a civil rights leader, activist, minister, and moral philosopher. Dr. King said, everyone can be great because anyone can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and your verb agree to serve. In other words, you can be from the hood. You don't have to know about Plato and Aristotle to serve. You don't have to know Einstein's theory of relativity to serve. You don't have to know the second theory of thermodynamics in physics to serve. You only need a heart full of love and grace, a soul generated by love. In a few short sentences, Dr. King shares so much with us about greatness and about service, that each and every one of us can access greatness, that service lay at the core of greatness, that a heart full of grace is the equipment you need. What a remarkable thing to share. By the 1968 drum major Instinct sermon, Dr. King has won the Nobel Peace Prize. He has delivered some of the most memorable, most important oratory in the English language. He has challenged the nation to pursue civil rights, pursue peace, and pursue an end to poverty. And the fulcrum around which greatness pivots is service. A heart full of grace, a soul generated by love. As we honor Dr. King today, let's remember those elements of greatness. Let us pay tribute to his work for greater equality, justice, and peace through our service and through our hearts full of grace. Thank you. So now I have the pleasure of introducing to some, well, actually introducing to none in this room, presenting to everyone, Senator Chuck Schumer. And for those of us who have loved him forever, it's Uncle Chuck.
Are we fighting the fight? Are we going to dump Trump? One way or another. Okay, it is great to be back on this serious, solemn, and important day. One thing I want to mention before I speak, your keynote speaker, Nikole Hannah-Jones, who wrote 1619 and did the podcast, if you make me one promise, if you haven't read her work in the New York Times or listened to her podcast, promise me you will. And what she shows you is slavery isn't something in history. African Americans live with slavery every single day now. So read it. Okay, so I'm glad to be here and to honor Dr. King. And first, I want to share a moment of maybe we can have a moment of silent prayer for the continued health of Congressman John Lewis. You know, he fought alongside Dr. King, and now he's having his own fight with cancer. So if we could just have a moment of silent prayer for John. Thank you. Now, you know, it's not a coincidence that today, Dr. King's Day, is the only day on our calendar dedicated to a single individual. We have lots of holidays. We have President's Day for all the presidents, and we have Veterans Day for the veterans, and Mother's Day for the mothers, and Father's Day for the fathers, and July 4th for our birthday, nation's birthday. But only one holiday is for Dr. King. Why? Because he uplifted humanity. You can say that about almost no one, but he did. And I like to think of it this way. Dr. King, on his broad shoulders, with moral, intellectual strength and faith, took a giant mirror and held it on his broad shoulders. And with his eloquence, he forced America to look into that mirror. And when America looked there, they didn't like what they saw. And so he exposed our worst impulses. He exposed what's wrong, which America had swept under the rug for hundreds of years. But today, we cannot just talk about the past, given the urgency of today. If Dr. King were here today to hold up that mirror and force America to look in it, here's what we'd see. We'd see a country that twice elected an African-American president, but is still so very far away from eliminating the vicious evils of bigotry and racism and intolerance. We'd see income agglomerating to the very top. The wealthy people who have the power do well, and it's even harder to stay in the middle class and get to the middle class. We'd see families struggling, sitting around the dinner table. How are we going to pay this medical bill? How are we going to pay the mortgage? How are we going to afford college? We'd see a government racked with divisiveness and partisanship. And worst of all, we would see presiding over this dysfunction a man in the White House who is fundamentally dishonest. I'll say it like it is, he's a liar. Who appeals to bigotry, divisiveness, helps the rich and powerful at the expense of everybody else, and stretches the bounds of the presidency to simply help himself and his cronies. As I said, he's got to go. But there's something else that Dr. King's mirror would show us. It would show us the goodness and strength and faith that all of us have within us, and that the American people have within them. He would remind us that the arc of the moral universe is long, very long, all too long, but that it bends in the direction of justice if we fight for it. And he would tell us not to wait for another day to take back our country from those who dishonor the values for which Dr. King, Congressman Lewis, and so many others shed their blood. I take inspiration, as you know. Dr. King was not only one of the greatest speakers, thinkers, moral leaders the globe has ever seen. He was also one of the greatest writers. People forget that. He was a brilliant writer. And one of the greatest letters in American letters is the letter from the Birmingham jail, which I read to myself all the time, and I read it every time I come here. He was jailed in a little tiny, cold, unlit jail cell for protesting in Birmingham, and the white, so-called moderate leaders of Birmingham went in to see him. And they said, "Dr. King, slow down. You may be right, but slow down, wait." And here's the letter he wrote in that cell. Not the whole thing, but I'll read you part of it. "We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional God-given rights. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say wait. For years now I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you have seen the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brethren smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness toward white people. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, "Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean?" When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you. When your wife and mother are never given the respected title, Mrs. When you are harried by day and haunted by night, living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments. When you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it so difficult to wait. We must never wait. God willing, when I become majority leader at the end of this year, we won't wait to finally confront the blemishes that Dr. King held up in his mirror. We won't wait to reverse decades of disinvestment in public housing. We won't wait to make health care and prescription drugs affordable. We won't wait to make sure everyone, I mean everyone, has the right to vote and can exercise it. We won't wait to end the scourge of gun violence that's killing our children, and we won't wait to provide better opportunities for people getting out of jail and trying to rejoin society. We won't wait. We won't wait. We won't wait. You're better than me. So in conclusion, as we depart from this righteous gathering, let us hope and pray and work for Dr. King's dream with the fierce urgency of now, remembering that sometimes all it takes to change the entire fabric of society is a single person whose virtue and conviction and resolve become a mighty hammer for justice. If we can do that, then one day, the solemnity of Martin Luther King Jr. Day will be a thing of the past. One day, we hope and pray, we'll celebrate this holiday with parades and laughter for the victory we achieved over racism and inequality in America. One day, thank you for letting me join you to honor one of the greatest men to ever grace our country. May he continue to be a stirring example for all of us in the days to come. May he importune us to take America back. We will not wait. Thank you, everybody. God bless you, and happy Dr. King Day.
Thank you, Uncle Chuck. So one of the unintended benefits of being able to co-host today's event is I get to introduce some of the most powerful, dedicated, and committed public servants in the state of New York. Councilmember Corey Johnson, Speaker of the New York City Council, at the age of 19, entered public service as an activist, first for LGBTQ causes, and then expanding to issues like tenant advocacy. He has led the City Council with dignity. He's pushed the envelope. He's made all of us at the council better council members. My friend, New York City Council member and Speaker for the New York City Council, Corey Johnson.
Rob had to reach down a little bit to hug me this morning. Good morning. I want to thank my friend, Robert Cornegy, for that introduction, and I want to thank the future Majority Leader of the United States Senate, Chuck Schumer, for being here today and being for New York City every single day. And you're going to hear, as Councilmember Cornegy said, from a lot of wonderful elected officials here in our great city. So I'm not going to name all of them that have yet to speak yet, but I will name one person, and it's the one person that Senator Schumer named. I am just deeply honored to be able to stand on the same stage as Nikole Hannah-Jones. I am so grateful for her. I can't really see out into the crowd, but I'm so grateful for her, and you all know she's one of the most eloquent and important writers of our time on race, and she is the one who gave us the awe-inspiring, powerful 1619 Project. A big round of applause for Nikole Hannah-Jones and everything she's done. So I am proud to stand alongside you today, and I will be proud to stand alongside all of you in the future. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King inspired the way I tried to lead the New York City Council as Speaker. And what do I mean when I say that? I mean caring for the most vulnerable with a respect for humanity and an awakened culture of empathy in everything that we do. I try to do that every day at the City Council. And when I leave my apartment every morning, there is a piece of paper I see when I'm opening my front door to leave that I scribbled a long time ago to remind me every day of why I do this work. And on that piece of paper it says, do the most good for the people who need it the most. And I believe that is in the vein of Dr. King. My mother, who was my lunch lady growing up, and who now runs a homeless shelter in Massachusetts, taught me that. And standing here today, remembering Dr. King, I am reminded of that message. I love New York City. I believe it is the greatest city in the world, and it's an honor for me to be able to do a little bit of service every single day in our great city. But that does not mean that I am blind to the challenges that we face as a city and there are big challenges that we face as a city, or the fact that, quote, doors of opportunity, as Dr. King said, are still not open to all of our children. And that is because we still have some very, very serious challenges. It would be easy for me to stand up here today and rail against the racist in chief in the White House, but instead I think it's a little harder and equally as important for us to look at ourselves in the mirror as New Yorkers and to talk about, even though we live in the greatest city in the world, what are some of the challenges that we face in the year 2020. And the doors of opportunity are not open for all of our children when we have the most segregated school system in the United States of America. The doors of opportunity are not open when we have, out of 8.6 million New Yorkers, we have 1 million New Yorkers who are considered food insecure, who don't have enough food every single day to feed themselves and their children and their families. The doors of opportunity have not opened when we have, today and last night, in our shelter system, 80,000 people experiencing homelessness, including 1 in 10 of every public school student in New York City. That is, during a calendar school year, over 100,000 children in New York City that have been deemed homeless at one point during the school year. Now, you know and I know that we have made great progress since Dr. King's time, but we are still grappling with many of the same challenges and issues that he fought for and against. Racism, poverty, military conflicts. Dr. King knew that these were not easy issues. He knew that all of us had to take bold action to make change happen. He said, "Nothing will be done until people of goodwill put their bodies and their souls in motion." And that is what he said just a few days before he was killed. Those are words to live by. I am fortunate, all of us, I believe, are fortunate that at the City Council there are many people, including many of you here today, who fight with us to realize Dr. King's vision and dream. And I'll tell you some of the good things I think we are doing. Together, we, New Yorkers, are closing Rikers Island, a penal colony on the East River that has symbolized brutality and inhumanity. Together, we started a program I am so proud of, and I get the chills talking about it, called Fair Fares, a program to give half-price Metro cards to New Yorkers living in poverty. Last week, the 100,000th person signed up for Fair Fares. 100,000 New Yorkers are now getting half-price Metro cards. We are fighting for affordable housing. When we say affordable housing, the question is, affordable to who? So we are fighting for real affordable housing, helping those who are currently homeless, helping those who are low income, helping those who are struggling to make ends meet, because we have an affordability crisis that is gripping our city. There is so much that each one of us can do to fulfill the legacy of Dr. King, and that is why I am so grateful to be with you here today with this community of souls in motion. I will close by saying that you all know this. We are living through painful, dark, and difficult times. We have a racist in the White House who wants to build walls and divide us. I won't say his name and mar this occasion, but I will say we will never let him succeed. We owe it to ourselves to speak out loudly than we ever have before. Let us continue to work with unflinching resolve towards Dr. King's dream of equality and justice. And please let us continue to lift each other up through this struggle. And I will just end on a personal note. I am really proud of where I came from. And as I mentioned, my mom was my lunch lady growing up. There were 12 units of public housing in the town that I grew up in, and my family lived in one of those 12 units of public housing from when I was 9 years old until I graduated high school, and I moved to New York City at 19 years old, having never been outside of Massachusetts before. And so I stand here today as an openly gay man, as the only openly HIV-positive elected official in the state of New York, as someone who thank you. As someone who this last July 13th celebrated 11 years sober from drugs and alcohol, my biggest accomplishment in life. And why do I tell you that? I tell you that because it is important for each one of us, those of us in elected office and those of us who are not, to speak openly and honestly about the obstacles that we have faced, to try to inspire others, and to destigmatize the issues that have been used to keep people down for too long. And so I stand here today on the shoulders of Dr. King, on the shoulders of Audre Lorde, on the shoulders of Bayard Rustin, on the shoulders of those who came before me to clear the path and to make it possible for that suicidal, despondent 16-year-old in that small town who never knew of the world outside of that public housing development that I grew up in, who came to New York City with big dreams and have been able to leave my mark. And I am proud of the work that we all do together, and I will end with this. New York City is the greatest city in the world. We are the greatest city in the world. We are the greatest city in the world. We are the city that has given the world J-Lo and Spike Lee. We are the city that is the home of the Lemon Ice King of Corona. We are the city that built the Empire State Building in less than 18 months. The labor laws were a little different, but we still did it. We are the city that's standing not that far from here in New York Harbor. The Statue of Liberty has stood for generations, holding a torch which has been a beacon to immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees. Immigrants are welcome here in New York City. We are the city that out of 8.6 million people who live here, 37% of New Yorkers, 37% of the folks who call our great city home were not born in the United States of America, but came here with dreams and aspirations for themselves and for their families. We are the city that not that long ago, last June of 2019, 50 years earlier, some brave activists rose up on Christopher Street and decided to fight back, which lit a match towards worldwide equality. We are the greatest city in the world, but greatness is not guaranteed. Justice is not guaranteed. Progress is not guaranteed. We gather here today to celebrate Dr. King, but also to take stock and to remind us of the long, difficult, winding road that is ahead of us. And I look forward to working on bending that arc of our moral universe with all of you. Happy ML King Day. Thank you very, very much.
You have to raise the temperature so it's so high that you can't be ignored. That's what Dr. King's advocacy was about. He wanted to change the climate where action was necessary, where everyone understood the urgency of the moment. He believed in creating a tension that was real and change-making, and that's what he did. So thank you, Eric, for your leadership and advocacy. Dr. King once said The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of convenience and comfort, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. I've never seen a time more thick with challenge and controversy than now. And we have had difficulty over these last few months because we've lost some of our brightest lights. One man who passed that measure and shone so brightly was Congressman Elijah Cummings, a man that I worked with in Congress. And if you knew him like we knew him, he was a North Star. He was someone whose moral compass and character shone brighter than anyone. His death was an enormous loss for America, and an enormous loss for Americans who were fighting for justice. In his honor, with his legacy, as we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy, we have to continue the fight that he dedicated his life towards. Another stalwart who we must maintain in our prayers is Congressman John Lewis. He was diagnosed with cancer, and I know of no man in America today who is built better for this fight. Congressman Lewis, his life was a story of what it means to walk in righteousness, to fight for justice every day, to pay the penalty, to take the burden, and to carry on. And I am privileged to work with him every day in Congress today. So right now, in this moment we are in, we have to follow these lights. These leaders and the teachings and guidance that Dr. King gave us is real. The real measure of our success and our worth is where we are standing now in this time of division and injustice. It means standing up for every person who has been harmed by Donald J. Trump and his allies. Donald Trump's presidency and rhetoric has empowered neo-Nazis, racists, bigots, those who lack morality or even basic humanity. This president refuses to condemn racism, calling white supremacists who killed Heather Heyer very fine people. And at the border, Trump is the one who is tearing children from their mother's arms, leaving children to die in prison-like places. And in recent months, we have seen the escalation of horrific anti-Semitic attacks on our Jewish communities right here in New York City. Dr. King always reminded us that we have the responsibility to speak up for the people who aren't being heard, for the marginalized, for the powerless, for those who have been made voiceless. And we have to take his lead and speak out and fight against every one of these incidents of violence, racism, bigotry, and hatred. And we do it with our voices, we do it with political action, we do it with our advocacy, and come November, we will do it with our votes. Everyday instances of racism need to be directly attacked and opposed. We have to demand that all people are treated with basic dignity and respect. Those of us in Congress must represent and protect the will of all the people, not just some of the people. And it is my job as your senator, as a white woman of extraordinary privilege, to lift up the voices of those who aren't being heard, to lift up the voices of Black elected leaders like you will hear from this stage, to make sure their voices are being amplified, to make sure I can lift up those who are being ignored, who have no power, who don't have fancy lobbyists, who don't throw millions and billions into our electoral system. Those are the voices that are being marginalized today, and those are the voices I will champion. In Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail, he made an argument about why he was there. You know, he's a preacher, so everything he ever did came from his faith. Stories like Esther in the Bible, that we were all chosen for a time such as this, are the things that inspired him. But he had to push back against advocates in Birmingham who were asking him, why are you here? Why are you in our place? Why are you here now? And why are you doing what you're doing? And he laid it out in this letter really clearly. He said, my job is to go where injustice is. Injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. We quote him and his views daily. He had to make the case he was there because he needed to act. He said, my job is direct action. My job is to turn up the heat. My job is to make it so no one can turn a blind eye to the injustices here, to the daily acts of racism against the people that live here, to the mothers and fathers who are losing their lives, to the little girl who wants to go to the local amusement park that's being opened and told you cannot go because black children are not allowed. He talked about the forming clouds in her mind that she was not worthy, giving her a lifelong burden of insecurity and worthlessness. That's why he said he was there. So when I take his lessons and I apply them to myself, I ask myself, why am I here? I am here to take direct action, to do my job in the U.S. Senate and write legislation, legislative action, advocacy, lifting up those stories and those voices. So what do I need to work on? I need to work on everything that harms our communities. How about job training and economic security to start with? That was something that Dr. King cared so deeply about, and Coretta Scott King continued in her lifetime. They believed in full employment as a right. What better idea to address today's unemployment? And it's not just unemployment, it's underemployment. How many people do you know who can't put together enough hours to provide for their families, who can't get the job training to get a better paying job, who cannot earn their way into the middle class no matter how hard they work? That's the impediment of institutional racism. Those are the structural challenges that cannot so easily be overcome. I wrote a bill, Raise the Wage Act, basic legislation to make sure everyone earns at least a living wage. It's why I introduced a bill called Build Local, Hire Local Act, to make sure when a community wants to build its infrastructure, that local workers are hired, that local workers are trained, so those jobs don't get outsourced to people from outside the community. That's how you address the legacy of racism in infrastructure, the legacy of racism in where economic development is invested in. That's how we do it. It starts by ending gun violence in a community that plagues the whole community. That means it's not safe for a teenage girl to go to a party with her friends because she is taken down by a stray bullet. It's why I wrote a bill, the Nyasha Pryor Yard anti-trafficking bill. She was killed by a stray bullet from a gun that was trafficked from out of this state into this state and sold directly to a gang member. Those are the kind of solutions we need because life in that way is unacceptable. Why should a mother be afraid to take her 4-year-old son to a park bench in Brooklyn? Because he died on the park bench in Brooklyn. That's a reality we should not accept. It starts with addressing institutional racism in our healthcare system. Why is our maternal mortality rate higher than any other place in this country? The United States has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the whole world. But if you are a black woman, you are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. If you are a black woman in New York City, you are 12 times more likely to die in childbirth. That is an unacceptable fact. And so I'm working on to change that with a bill called the Moms Act, which would make sure no matter what emergency room, no matter what hospital you go to, that they are trained to deal with bias, racism, and have the tools and equipment they need in every room so every mother survives childbirth. We have endured so much under President Trump. And the anecdote to his presidency is us. Nothing ever happens in Washington unless regular people stand up and demand it. Nothing ever happens in Washington until we turn up the temperature so it's so hot that you can't ignore it. Those are the lessons of Elijah Cummings. Those are the lessons that John Lewis continues to teach us. Those are the lessons that MLK Jr. left us in his writings, in his speeches, and in his life's legacy. So we have an opportunity in these next few months to change the outcomes with our voices. We have an opportunity to flip the U.S. Senate. We have the opportunity to hold the U.S. House. And we have the opportunity to defeat President Trump at the ballot box. So in order to do that, we are going to have to protect our voting system. One of the pieces of legislation I've been working with John Lewis for the past decade is the Voter Empowerment Act. It takes every aspect of our voting rights and makes sure that our voices can be heard. It makes sure voters cannot be disenfranchised based on where they live. It makes sure that people can register to vote online. It makes sure that there's a paper receipt to every ballot. It makes sure that our voices cannot be taken away from us. So I hope every single one of you will support the work we are doing, the support that Stacey Abrams is doing to ensure our voting rights are protected. If we fight for these goals, we will have a stronger and better country. We will be able to assure that no voice is left unheard, and we will be able to meet the challenges of today. So let us take this time of challenge and controversy to stand on the right side of history, to rise up against the hatred and division we see in our own communities, to lift up the voices of those who are not being heard and are not being listened to fight for unity throughout our communities and throughout our state. The time is now to fight for justice.
It's now my pleasure to introduce to you New York City's public advocate, Jumaane Williams. I got more. I'm just going to say, here is a man who is doing the work, right? He's passed landmark legislation already in the City Council, including the Fair Chance Act to combat employment discrimination. A man who's doing the work, Jumaane.
What's up, everybody? How you doing? Happy MLK Day. I want to thank BAM and the Borough President. My mom is somewhere here. Patricia Williams is sitting. Oh, where is she? Over there. All right. She didn't want to be shouted out, but my mom is over there. Thank you, everyone, for giving me an opportunity to reflect on life and legacy of Dr. King, personal hero of mine who was often deliberately misunderstood, mischaracterized, and sanitized. I do want to say thank you, everyone who voted for me last year. I'm now the 4th black elected official ever citywide. Since I was young, I always admired Dr. King. He was one of my many heroes, along with Spider-Man, X-Men, Batman, and Malcolm X. I admired the way he stood up for people, nonviolently, which takes even more strength. Realizing where he was, recognizing his situation, and how to use that to his advantage. Sustaining that strength, taking strength from the Most High, and lessons from the Bible. It is incredibly disturbing to see that Dr. King's legacy is sanitized and misrepresented. Dr. King was an extraordinary leader who opposed violence, but that doesn't mean he was consigned to be docile. That doesn't mean he wanted things simply to be peaceful. He was a disruptor. He was a righteous agitator. He was a moral revolution. He was a revolutionary. He was a rabble-rouser. Those who don't believe in the cause attack the tactics. There are people who want to change, but they don't want the work. They celebrate the work of others, but not how they got it done. They may recall the words, but neither the meaning nor the context. They remember the dream, but not the fight to make the dream a reality, or that Dr. King said he was worried if his dream had turned into a nightmare, or if it integrated into a burning house. Not the fact that those dreams are often born inside of a jail cell. People use this misrepresentation to attack modern-day acts of protest and dissent. Dr. King refused to condemn any protest and the young people taking over the streets during that day. Don't let them make you pit Malcolm X and Dr. King. They were both revolutionary, no matter what they do. And they both were murdered violently because they try to tell you that it is the manner how you protest. But the problem the powers that be have is the fact that you protest at all. Every generation looks back on the previous generation with a different set of eyes. They believe that if they were there, they'd have the fortitude to stand with the movement. Well, right now, we need the strength of that movement. The legacy is to keep that moral fortitude, keep the focus. We are in a movement right now. History is going to look back at us and ask you, where were you and what did you do when there were children in cages? Where were you and what did you do when trans black women were being murdered with impunity? Where were you and what did you do when the things that Dr. King fought for all human beings, and especially the black community that has still not lived up to the American dream? Where were you and what did you do when there was a bigot who's only missing a hood in the White House spewing orange madness across this nation? Where were you and what did you do when you remembered it wasn't just that one bigot, but an entire party and people who continue to support him? Where were you and what did you do when you remembered after we got out of this darkness? Because there will be casualties, we'll get to the other side. But the lessons, did you remember that it wasn't just the Republican parties? There are Democrats across this nation who have led cities and led states and still had the problems we have. We supposedly live in a progressive city, yet we have the most segregated school system in the entire nation. So let's not get it twisted. We must make sure everyone is held accountable. I'm a Democrat, though. Now, recent events of the last few weeks that saw hateful anti-Semitic attacks in our city and our state were a reminder that human condition is an ever work in progress. It is in moments like these that our society must commit to work even harder to find common ground and provide a space for healing and honest conversation. In the Daily News, I talked today about James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman. 3 civil rights workers, 1 black and 2 Jewish men, brutally murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan in Philadelphia, Mississippi on the night of June 21st, 1964. Their death helped spark the passage of the 1964 Voting Rights Act. This points to the historical reality that the two communities have worked together to address societal ills, that we must raise our collective voices together not only to condemn instances of anti-Semitism and racism and create meaningful platforms to have dialogue to address the underlying causes of these incidences. We can and we must lift up anti-Semitism, and we must continue to lift up racism and all bigotry. And I have to tell you here, we will not let the acts of anti-Semitism, we will not let the acts of Semitism be pitted against black and brown bodies in jail and bail reform. Those two things will not be confused, and they are separate conversations. We can have them both at the same time. We have to have these conversations. This week, as we celebrate the memory and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, the revolutionary Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I would like to ask all of my New Yorkers, my fellow New Yorkers, to look beyond the slogans, look beyond the euphemisms. As Dr. King said, let us rise up tonight with a greater readiness. Let us stand with a great determination. And let us move on these powerful days, these days of challenge to make America what it ought to be. We have an opportunity to make America a better nation. Peace and blessings. Thank you.
Raised in East New York and Williamsburg, Eric Gonzalez made history in November 2017 when he became the first Latino district attorney elected in New York State. He has implemented his own trailblazing initiatives, including bail reform, a young adult court, and a policy to reduce unfair immigration consequences in criminal cases. Please welcome our district attorney, Eric Gonzalez.
Good morning, Brooklyn. It's an honor for me to be here to speak to all of you at BAM. It means a lot to me to be here as we talk about the legacy of Dr. King. And each year, we set aside a sacred January Monday to honor and celebrate the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Now, we best remember Dr. King for fighting to tear down Jim Crow in the American South. But there is nowhere in our country where his vision and the lessons that we've learned from his life are not relevant. That is especially true right here in Brooklyn. As your Brooklyn District Attorney, I vow to stand to make sure that every community has safety, but I also stand to make sure that our criminal justice system treats every community fairly. Regardless of race, regardless of religion, or sexual identification, or even your income. Our justice system has to work for each and every one of us. Now, the challenges that Dr. King confronted were different than the challenges we have today. But let's be clear, and the borough president mentioned this, African American children and teens are 14 times more likely to die from gun violence. Across America, gross racial disparities, including mass incarceration, still haunt every aspect of our criminal justice system, from arrest to prosecution to conviction to length of sentence. This is unacceptable in 2020, as unacceptable as segregated lunch counters were 60 years ago. In Brooklyn, we're working to make a fairer justice system and to keep our families safe. Safety matters. More than a year ago, my office started to reduce our reliance on cash bail. As a result, hundreds of people who would have gone to Rikers Island, not because they posed a public safety threat, but because they were poor, were allowed to stay with their families. We're also diverting hundreds of people out of our criminal justice system who've been arrested and giving them services that deal with underlying health issues, whether it's addiction, mental health treatment, or other social services. These are people that we can help and keep our community safe by not incarcerating them. And we're doing all of this in Brooklyn while keeping our community safer than they've ever been. Now, this is something that you may not hear in the papers, but since 2016, not ancient history, since 2016, murders in Brooklyn have been reduced by 1/3. And I think that everyone in this room at BAM today understands what that means. Virtually every life that we've saved in Brooklyn has been a Black or Latino life. At my office, we are determined to make sure that we have fundamental fairness and safety in Brooklyn. We can't turn back to failed policies like stop and frisk, and we won't surrender to those who urge us wholesale retreat. Fairness and safety go hand in hand. Now, Dr. King recognized that wait has almost always meant never. I agree. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men and women are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. Dr. King said that we won't wait and we won't be deterred in the pursuit of justice here in Brooklyn. I ask for your guidance and your support as we continue working for safety anchored in fairness. May God bless each and every one of you. Thank you.
I am so pleased to introduce one of the most talented and unique artists working today. Son Little's music incorporates gospel, R&B, and rock and roll to outstanding effect. He has toured with Leon Bridges, Mumford & Sons, and Shaky Graves, and produced Mavis Staples' Grammy Award-winning record of See That My Grave Is Kept Clean. Please welcome Son Little.
Tom and Bobby, they're gone, they don't live here long, but I'm still knocking and clawing, wishing gon' give me the all or nothing. Get on, bang the guns, bang these drums. Oh, come hungry. They gone, left us with none but crumbs. But out in the fields, we're the same. Nothing changed. Cross my heart. For love, for money, for what? Trying to sell hot to the sun. Sex and candy, so young, but I'm gonna get me some rum and honey. You run till your heart feels numb. Boy, come in hungry. You gone, left us to scrap for crumb. But out in the fields, we're the same. That deal flash still get locked in a cage. Well, ain't we brave? Feel my rage across my heart. Nothing changed. Oh, I want Why do they treat me like I'm not a man? Well, I wonder, does anybody know just who I am? Or can I love the world exactly as it is? Or do I have to split? Is there anybody rooting for the kid? Oh, oh. Oh, mother, is this not the way you taught me to behave? I won't just sit here and let them treat me like I was a slave. Or can I love the world and hate how it makes me feel? Oh, girl, I wanna kneel. Is there anyone who's got my back for real? Oh, oh. Sometimes wonder, well, is it wrong if I do not want to live it? Oh, what can I love the world enough to give us bed? Or am I giving in? Or do we burn the old one down and start again? Start again, start again, oh, start again. Thanks a lot. It's a real honor to be here today to honor this incredible one in a zillion human being that we were so lucky to have here, and with all these wonderful people here today. That's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to talk anymore. Much better speakers in this room than me, for sure. But I will play another song. Everything is fine. Know that is a lie. Treacherously with the ties that bind. Try to run me wild. Either I am yours and you are mine. Maybe we was, but we don't have to suffer. You and I, we don't have to wait in the trenches every night. We don't have to follow in a line. We don't have to wait in the shadows for the sunshine. Now don't you waste my time. In a different light, we are shining in a warmer light. We are shining bright, but we don't have to suffer tonight. We don't have to wait in the trenches every night. We don't have to follow in a line. We don't have to wait in the shadows for sunshine. No, we don't have to suffer. We don't have to suffer. You and I, we don't have to wait in the trenches every night. We don't have to follow in a line. We don't have to wait in the shadows for the sunshine. No, we don't have to suffer tonight. We don't have to wait in the trenches every night. We don't have to follow in a line. We don't have to wait in the shadows for the sunshine. La 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 la. La 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 la. Thanks a lot. I'm so little.
I am so incredibly honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Nikole Hannah-Jones. Ms. Hannah-Jones is an award-winning investigative reporter for the New York Times, writing about racial injustice. Through thoughtful, scrupulously researched journalism, her work exposes the persistence of racial bias in our public policies and practices. She is the creator of the New York Times' astonishing 1619 project, chronicling the history and legacy of slavery in America. And she's a genius. She has been awarded a MacArthur Genius Fellowship, a Peabody Award, and a National Magazine Award, among many others. Please welcome Nikole Hannah-Jones.
Hello, Brooklyn. I have to say, I give speeches all over the country, but something about knowing I was going to stand in front of my Brooklyn folks has me nervous today, so please be gentle. Love y'all too. And my daughter made me promise that I'd say, hey, so hey, Naja. So we're gathered here today to talk about one of the greatest Americans that this country has ever produced. And this time of year is a year when we always seem to trot out that same speech, I Have a Dream, which was a powerful and important speech. But it's the only speech that we ever seem to hear about. And of course, that speech was given in 1963, and Dr. King would live on for 5 more years after that. And his speeches would become increasingly radical in those remaining 5 years. And then when we hear about I Have a Dream, we only tend to hear just a couple brief paragraphs in that speech. And those are the paragraphs that allow us to have this version of the homogenized, commodified king that makes us all feel like, well, we would have been marching with him too. But the truth is, at the time of King's death, most white Americans in this country were opposed to him. And the truth is that we know Some white Americans were so opposed to him that he was assassinated at the age of 39, 4 years younger than I am right now. And the truth is that that speech was actually a very long speech, and that when those 200,000 Americans, largely black, marched on our nation's capital, a capital by which the columns and the pavement and the pillars and the stones were all set by the hands of enslaved people, they were making a demand. And the demand was not that simply white children and black children could one day hold hands and go into the future where we sing Kumbaya. It was a demand for justice. It was a demand for this country to live up to its founding creeds. And so I want to turn us, as I start my speech, to a different passage in that long I Have a Dream speech. And that is the speech where King says, "We have come to this Capitol today to cash a check." He says, when the architects of our republic wrote those magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note. And that promissory note was not just written to white Americans, but that it was written to black Americans as well. And that these white men guaranteed that all Americans would have the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he comes and he says, we are here today in this nation's capital because America has defaulted on their promissory note as far as her citizens of color are concerned. And instead of honoring that sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check. So when we think about that, and we think about why we never happen to hear that passage when we are talking about the I Have a Dream speech, then we have to reset the way that King has been used now actually as a tool of oppression as well. That if we don't talk about the radical King, the King who was actually commanding not just justice but repair, then we can again deal with all of the inequality that we accept today, because we can imagine back then that we would have been on the right side of justice. So I want to go to another piece of King's work. This is from the letter to the Birmingham jail. And he talks about that the goal of America is freedom. And that as maltreated as black Americans have been, that our fates are tied up with the very destiny of this country. And then he says, before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, we were here. Now in doing that, King is evoking our heritage. He is saying we are not some people who came from somewhere else. We are people who predate this country itself. That we were here longer than that ship we all know about called the Mayflower, which lands in 1620. But that none of us grew up learning about that other ship called the White Lion, which lands in 1619. And it was on that ship carrying 20 to 30 enslaved Africans who will be sold into Virginia that, of course, sets our country on the track to become what it would be, far more than those pilgrims who landed at Plymouth Rock. So you may have heard about this small little project called the 1619 Project. This project was my life's dream. This project was the opportunity to take the 400th anniversary, think about that, in a country this young, the opportunity to commemorate 400 years of something, and that 400 years would be the introduction of slavery into what would become the United States. And that with that opportunity, we had a chance to claim that same legacy that King was claiming when he was demanding the rights of citizenship, the full rights of citizenship for people who have been here for 400 years. There's a reason he calls on Plymouth. It is to say we have been here longer than almost all of your ancestors, and yet we are still asking to be treated as citizens in the United States. This is what I was attempting to do with the 1619 Project, is to say nothing about this country could be left untouched by something that precedes our country by 150 years. That our laws, our policies, our institution, our culture, our legal system, all of these things have been impacted by that decision. And the reason we're even here today is because the descendant of enslaved people by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had to be still fighting in the 1940s and the 1950s and the 1960s for Black Americans to enjoy the full rights of citizenship in the country of their birth. So if we go back to that letter to the Birmingham jail, the second part of that paragraph, where he talks about before the pen of Jefferson etched those majestic words of the Declaration of Independence across the pages of history, that we were here. And we know those words. These are some of the most famous and known words in the English language. Many Americans can recite these words, the opening lines of the Declaration of Independence, without even having to look at the words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we know as Thomas Jefferson is writing those words in Philadelphia, he owns 130 human beings. We know that as he is writing those words in Philadelphia, he has brought his enslaved brother-in-law to sit and keep him comfortable as he makes the global case for freedom and why Americans have to leave the empire of Britain so that they will not be treated as slaves. And he knows as he's writing those words, that those words will not count for fully 1/5 of the population that lives in chattel slavery and will know not a single freedom that he is outlining in this declaration. Instead, they will, as the 1740 Slave Code says, that all their issue and their offspring, born or to be born, every time I read that phrase, it gives me chills, that all of their offspring, born or to be born, shall be and are hereby declared to be and remain forever and hereafter absolute slaves. He knows this as he's writing those words for liberty. And so when we think about our founding and our founding documents, we think about our Constitution as a document of liberation, and for white men it was. But for nearly everyone else, the majority of people in this country, women, Native people, and certainly Black people who you couldn't even call Black Americans because we did not have citizenship in our own land, that there was a denial of rights, and particularly for Black Americans, an absolute denial of any liberties outlined in that document. Now, the founders, of course, even though we often like to say you can't judge the past based on our current systems of morals, but the founders, of course, knew that this was wrong. They, of course, understood the glaring hypocrisy of a country founded on the inalienable individual rights of man while holding 1/5 of the population in absolute bondage. One of the founders, Luther Martin, a founder from Maryland, said to put slavery in the Constitution is inconsistent with the principles of our revolution. And so that's why, if you read the Constitution, you don't find the word slave in there at all. They wanted to preserve slavery while hiding the sin. And in fact, the first time that you see the word slavery mentioned in our Constitution is in the 13th Amendment, which abolishes something that our Constitution pretends does not exist. So how do we then deal with this hypocrisy of our founding? Well, we determined that we the people does not include Black people. That Black people are not only not citizens, but they are not even fully human like other human beings. And what the research shows us is that the racial caste system that begins with the introduction of slavery into the colonies hardens once we become our own country. Because it's quite one thing to blame slavery on the British Empire. It is another to start a new country based on liberation and practice slavery in that new land. We all know none of us want to be reminded of our hypocrisy. So all of us, in our own individual lives, try to mitigate the things that we know are hypocritical about ourselves. And the way we mitigated that was to invent a racial caste system that said that Black people were distinct, Black people must be degraded, Black people cannot be citizens of the country. As the Supreme Court ruled in Dred Scott, we were a slave race. that had no rights that a white man need respect. This caste system is a system that we still struggle with now, because you cannot say that people are so inhuman that we can buy and sell their children from them, that we can whip and torture them on forced labor camps that we often like to call plantations like Monticello, but they were slave labor camps. And then, on the day of freedom, recognize the full humanity of those people who yesterday we said were not human. And so the truth is, we are, as Dr. King said, a schizophrenic nation. Because we are a nation founded on an idea of liberty that was a complete lie for a large segment of our population. And so you saw Dr. King again and again and again through his speeches evoking that declaration, evoking those words of liberty. And when he does that, he is falling into a long tradition of black freedom fighters who, at the moment of the revolution, saw those words, the power in the words, even if the founders did not believe them to be true for all people in this country, black people did. We believed in this country when we had no reason to. And over, black people used those words of liberty to make their case for universal freedom for all citizens of this country. And in his I Have a Dream speech, the parts that we don't usually hear about this time of year, Dr. King is going back to that founding moment and saying it is time for this country to live up to its founding ideals. And of course, we are still trying to get this country to live up to its founding ideals. Because what I tried to show in the 1619 Project, and what Dr. King is evidence of, and what so many freedom fighters throughout our history are evidence of, is that black Americans, more than any other group, have fought to make this country a democracy. The first time in the history of the United States where we even began to resemble a true democracy was in the brief period of Reconstruction following the Civil War, where for the first time in the history since the British landed Jamestown in 1607, we actually have a semblance of multiracial democracy occurring in the South, where the formerly enslaved are serving in government with white Americans and passing some of the most progressive legislation that the South had ever seen. Of course, we know what happens after that. So it is during this period which historian Eric Foner calls the second founding, because the first founding didn't include most of us, but the second founding did. And this second founding was pushed largely by formerly enslaved people and their white allies. And we get the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which to this day is the most powerful civil rights law ever passed in this country. It outlaws discrimination in almost every aspect of American life. The 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, which, by the way, we were the third to the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. We did not lead in this. There were only 2 other countries that took longer than us. And the only other country that required a war to end slavery in the Americas was Haiti, where the enslaved overthrew their masters. Black Americans pushed for the 14th Amendment. It is the 14th Amendment which, for the first time in the history of this country, demands equal protection before the law of all citizens. There was no such thing in the law in America prior to that. And more importantly, it is the 14th Amendment where black people are saying we deserve to be treated as citizens in our own country, that you get the birthright citizens law. That is the 14th Amendment. To this day, we are one of the few countries in the world where an immigrant can come here and their child is automatically given citizenship. That is because of black Americans' resistance struggle. So if you are the child of immigrants, the grandchild of immigrants, the great-grandchild of immigrants, you can thank black Americans for your citizenship. It's always amazing how folks are quick to give us credit for the bad things, but never want to give us credit for the good ones. And of course, in the 15th Amendment, this is where we get universal suffrage, at least for men. Women would not come, of course, for several decades, but in the 15th Amendment, it is the understanding that in America, citizenship is defined by your ability to vote, and that nothing makes you less of a citizen than having your vote denied, which of course tells us why we still see those efforts to suppress the vote right now. So women's suffrage wouldn't come until 1920 with the 19th Amendment, which the 100th anniversary will be in August of this year. But we also know that white women were not immune to white supremacy either. And often they were fighting against black women getting the right to vote, and black women did not get suffrage in the year 1920. In fact, most black women in this country would have to wage a second battle to get the rights that they were supposed to have been guaranteed in 1920, and for black men to get the rights they were supposed to have been guaranteed with the 15th Amendment. This woman here is a woman by the name of Amelia Boynton Robinson, who recently died at more than 100 years old. She was a regular citizen in Selma, Alabama. Selma was a majority black city, but just 1% of the black people in that town could vote because of a 100-year period of sustained racial terrorism that black Americans faced at the end of slavery. It was her who actually pressed Dr. King to come to Selma to organize black voters. And it was her who was part of that first march known as Bloody Sunday, where she was nearly beaten to death and left on the side of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Of course, Dr. King would then come after that and finish that march for voting rights. And a few months later, because of what happened that day on Bloody Sunday, we would get the 1965 Voting Rights Act passed by Lyndon B. Johnson. So we see through black resistance, we move towards democracy, and then we pull back. So Reconstruction is followed by 100 years of apartheid and racial terrorism, and then once again, black Americans have to wage a war against their own countrymen in order to move this country back towards democracy. We get the second wave of the civil rights movement, which occurs between the 1940s after World War II and culminates with the 1968 passage of the Fair Housing Act. Now, I want you to think about this. The 1964 Civil Rights Act simply guaranteed the rights that black people had gotten in the 1866 Civil Rights Act a year before. The 1965 Voting Rights Act guarantees the right black people were supposed to have gotten with the with the 15th Amendment passed right after the Civil War. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, that ends our racist immigration quota system that limited the number of black and brown immigrants who could come into the United States in an effort to maintain a white supremacist nation. Because of the civil rights movement, those quotas were alleviated. So specifically, if you are a black or brown immigrant in this country, you can also thank the fact that you were able to immigrate to the United States to the black resistance struggle. Somebody know what happened to my screen? Anyone? Got it, okay. Maybe somebody didn't like what I was saying, just playing. So we should think about that though, right? Because part of the process of assimilation, if you are a new immigrant to this country, is to immediately distance yourself from native-born black Americans. We should rethink that that is a narrative that serves white supremacy. And the fact that once large numbers of black and brown people were able to immigrate to the United States because of the black freedom struggle, they immigrated to a country where all legal discrimination had been purged from the law. So you did not have to experience generations of living under racial apartheid, and that is a different experience altogether. And then the last of the great civil rights legislation, the Northern Civil Rights Bill, as it was known, was the Fair Housing Act in 1968. It was considered the Northern Civil Rights Bill because housing was how white Americans accomplished Jim Crow in the North. You didn't have to bar black people from your schools and your libraries and your restaurants if black people couldn't live in your neighborhood. And so what you saw was when they were trying to push the Fair Housing Act, all of the white support for civil rights disappeared. And those very northern congressmen who were pressing civil rights law that was going to affect the South and make the backward South behave, suddenly turned their backs when the civil rights law was coming to their own backyards. The only reason we get the Fair Housing Act of 1968 is because Dr. King is assassinated, and 100 cities go up in flames. There are armed National Guardsmen guarding the nation's capital, and it's only then that we get to the point in this country where we decide that you should not be able to discriminate against someone moving next door to you simply because that person descended from the enslaved. Think about that. When we think about the Black resistance struggle and the Black efforts to actually turn the United States into a democracy, then you understand that every other rights struggle in this country owes its inheritance and its legacy to the Black resistance struggle. When Black people fight for civil rights, they have never fought only for their own rights. Every civil rights law that has been passed bars discrimination not only against race, but against nationality, against gender. All of these laws are about making America for all citizens, because there's something about being on the bottom where you don't want to just get rights for yourself. You understand the importance of universal rights for all human beings, and that is what Black Americans in this country have long supported. So when you think about the women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, the disability rights movement, all of them come out of the Black freedom struggle. When gay Americans go to the Supreme Court and argue that they have a constitutional right to marry, they use the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, passed after the end of slavery to ensure the formerly enslaved have the rights of citizenship, and that is how they win their rights. So I'm wrapping up, I promise. When they told me 20 minutes, I was like, I've never given a 20-minute speech in my life. So I find it helpful sometimes to do a timeline, because one of the things that I hear in my work all the time is, slavery was a long time ago, why don't you get over it? And my answer to that is, nobody wants to get over slavery more than Black folks, trust me. But what's important to me is to understand that anti-Black racism is in the actual DNA of our country. When you understand that the English landed Jamestown in 1607, and it takes only 12 years to import and purchase the first enslaved Africans to be sold into slavery. 12 years. We aren't even thinking of becoming the United States. We aren't even an established colony yet we have already established racialized slavery. It would take 150 years before we even decide to become a country. So the institution of slavery and the belief that it is okay to buy and sell human beings as long as they are of African descent is 150 years old before we even decide we want to become our own nation. It would take another 100 years before we abolish the institution of slavery, behind just Brazil and Cuba. Now think about how many of you have been raised to think, yeah, we had slavery, but we led the fight to abolish it. We did not. That is false. The deadliest war in American history, some 700,000 lives have to be shed to end the institution of slavery in this country. We were wedded to this institution, North and South. Slavery was practiced in New York, and at the time of the Civil War, the mayor of New York actually threatened to succeed with the South because so much of its industry depended on slave-grown cotton that it felt its fate was tied with the South and not with the North. 100 years of racial apartheid would follow the end of the Civil War, where the majority of Black Americans were not allowed to enjoy the legal rights of citizenship. And then, in 1976, the most important moment in all of American history occurred. I was born. Are there any historians in here? Okay, that might not be factually accurate, but I bring that up to say, I am 43 years old, and I am part of the first generation of Black Americans in the history of our presence here who was born with full legal rights of citizenship. My father was born in apartheid Mississippi. This is not ancient history. Dr. King could still be alive with us today if he had not been assassinated. We like to think that this was a long time ago, and it was not. I am not a young woman, but I'm certainly not an old woman. 10 years before I was born, it was legal to deny me the right to live where I wanted to live, to go to a public library. It was illegal for me to exist in several states because my mother is white and my father is black, and it was illegal for black and white people to marry and procreate in several states 10 years before I was born. This is not an ancient history. And so if we wonder why we still struggle, why we still have so much inequality, why there's still so much work to do, why in this city our children attend some of the most segregated schools in the country, it is because we have never rid ourselves of that legacy that just ended legally, less than 50 years ago. And we know that today we are still struggling to make this country a democracy. We are still struggling for this country to treat Black Americans as full citizens. And often, as we were back then, Black Americans are struggling alone. We are fighting for democracy in a country that doesn't think we all deserve an equal shot at it. And we continue to play this role. When we think about what we're told about Black contributions, people will give us music. We've done a lot with music, and that's true. The only true American music was created by Black folks. That is true. Some folks will give us that, we, through our brute labor, built this country's wealth, not acknowledging the agricultural skill, the architectural skill, the ironworking skill that we also had. But the most pivotal role that Black Americans have played is to actually make this country a democracy. More than any other group of people. Because democracy for us could never just be beautiful words on paper. We had to make it a reality in order for us to fully realize our citizenship in a country that didn't think we were citizens. And so I think a lot about, in this 400 years of struggle, and Lord knows every year for Black folks has been a struggle. I think about how in 1897, W.E.B. Du Bois said, "Between me and the world, there is ever an unasked question. How does it feel to be a problem?" This is how we have been defined since the moment we got here. Something to be fixed, something to be erased, something to be removed. If you Google the Negro problem, you will find an unending number of studies trying to solve what's wrong with Black folks. So I would like to argue that in this 400th year, we need to stop thinking about Black people as the problem and seeing us as the solution that we've always been. When you look at polling, research, what it shows is that Black Americans, more than any other group, vote for the common good. We support the common good. We believe in the collective. So when you look at things like support for universal health care, support for a livable wage, opposition to the death penalty, all of these things, Black people have the highest levels of support of all racial groups. Even recently, despite the fact that Black people have double the unemployment of white Americans, 1/10 of the wealth, when they asked, should this be a country that allows refugees in, Black Americans had the highest rate of all groups to say yes, even though we too are suffering, let in other people who are suffering and need help. This is who we are, and we need look no further than the 2016 election. to understand how Black Americans are the vanguard of this democracy. Every other racial group was split. Black folks were not playing. Now, we were told, of course, that that election was about economic anxiety. Yet we know no one has more economic anxiety than Black Americans. And yet, they did not vote for a president that many people felt ran on a racist, white nationalist platform. Now, if you look at the numbers, I don't know if you guys can see this. More than 90% of Black Americans voted against Donald Trump. Now, Black men, some of y'all were a little problematic, about 80%. 80% of y'all, but Black women were 98%. Now, the margin of error was bigger than 2%, so I actually think none of Black women voted for Donald Trump. But what that tells you, and the surveys show this, that Black women above all vote for community and believe in a common good and believe that our faiths are intertwined. When the Combahee River Collective gathered in 1974, they said if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression. Think about that. And so, in closing, I would argue that if we want to see King's dream finally fulfilled, and not a homogenized dream of people holding hands. Frankly, I don't care if my daughter holds hands with somebody else's daughter. But a radical vision where we repair the damage that has been done to Black Americans, where we move towards a true sense of equality and justice, where people don't have to try to get by on a wage that doesn't pay their bills, where some people get to go to a public school that has everything that looks like a private school and the rest of the kids have to do with what they can. If we want that radical dream that King had, then I would recommend that we listen to Black women, starting with this one. Thank you. Y'all been amazing. Thank you.
Incredible stuff. Oh, man. Okay, as the First Lady of New York City, Shirley McRae manages a robust portfolio to advance an ambitious agenda in support of all New Yorkers. She created Thrive NYC, the most comprehensive mental health plan of any city or state in the nation.
Thank you, Kathy, for your inspired leadership of BAM. Hello, Brooklyn. Happy New Year. I love you, I appreciate you. What a year we had in 2019. But I always feel good when I'm in my home borough of Brooklyn. What a year we had. I did a lot of looking back. I mean way back. And I am so grateful to Nikole Hannah-Jones and all the writers and the researchers for the work that they did with the New York Times 1619 project. Aren't we? Isn't she phenomenal? I could listen to her all day, right? We need to hear that. That project not only reveals the past and reframes our history, it helps us understand our place in the present, doesn't it? Yeah, and that's what this celebration does too. For decades, BAM has provided a space for us to reflect on what Dr. King's legacy means for us today. And there is still so much more for us to learn from the past, and not just from our collective experiences, but our individual experiences as well. I'm gonna tell you something. 2 weeks ago, I I learned something that I had never realized from my own family's history. My father was a Buffalo Soldier. Yeah, I never realized that. I knew he was in the Army and that he had served abroad, but he was in the 9th Cavalry Regiment and served briefly in North Africa during World War II. And that was new information for me. This is how deeply our history is buried sometimes. I have a photo of him in his uniform, and he was 18 years old when he enlisted. 18. He was younger than our son Dante is now, just a boy. And I can't imagine how he must have felt heading overseas to fight for a country that didn't respect him and didn't believe in him. Our past and our present are filled with so many hidden truths, cruel truths, and harsh realities. The past is also brimming, though, with stories of people who overcame incredible odds, who fought for a better life for themselves, their families, and their communities. People who stood up for the rights and dignity of people who looked like them and people who did not look like them. People like Martin Luther King Jr., who called for a revolution of values and helped organize people of all ethnicities to march on Washington to demand economic justice. And then there are people like all of you. Tell me, Brooklyn, who was there with us in person or in spirit in 2012 as our family marched silently down Fifth Avenue to bring an end to stop and frisk? Who was there? Okay, I always see a few hands. Are you being shy or what? Okay, how many of you joined the biggest single protest in the nation's history, the Women's March of 2017? How many of you were there? All right, we got a few more. How many of you stood in solidarity with the brave students who walked out of their classrooms 2 years ago to stop gun violence? How many of you were there? Can I see some hands? All right, I see a few. And who was with us 2 weeks ago on the Brooklyn Bridge as we came together to denounce the rise of anti-Semitism and say in a united voice, hate has no place here? How many of you were there? Okay, I see we got to get more of you out. When we look to the past, even to the very recent past, we see how hate has a way of spreading into every crevice and corner unless we stand in its way. That's why we owe it to each other to fight for the dignity of every worker, the education of every child, the freedom of every worshiper, and the well-being of every person. So today, as we celebrate Dr. King's vision and his work, I ask you to stay focused on the positive. Stay focused on the things that bring us together. You heard Nikole Hannah-Jones, didn't you? She said, we gotta stay focused. It's not over. Can you do that? Oh, come on. Do I have to come out there? Can you do that? That's better. All right, now. It is my pleasure to introduce the love of my life and partner in all things, our mayor, Bill de Blasio.
You almost had Shirlane coming out into the crowd there. To ensure that people fight for what is right and fight against all that we see around us that isn't working for us. I want to thank Shirlane for her fighting spirit. Let's thank our First Lady. Were you just spellbound by Nikole Hannah-Jones? When she said that our nation's born out of an idea, based on an idea and a lie at the same time. Doesn't that just bring together all of what we have felt? That there is something greater that we're to aspire to, that Dr. King pointed us towards, and yet we have had to live through so many lies. Dr. King was willing to say things that were not popular in his own time. Do not let the fact that there's a day named after him, or a stamp with his face on, or a memorial in Washington, do not let that obscure the fact that in his own time he said some very inconvenient truths. He said things that got him in trouble. He said things that the powers that be did not like. He was vilified. He was attacked. We honor him today, but we have to remember so many did not honor him in his own time. What Nikole has given us is so powerful. It's a reminder that Dr. King often revealed those truths before people wanted to hear them in so many quarters. And Dr. King did not only talk about the African American experience, he talked about this country as a whole. He did not only talk about oppression of one people, he talked about oppression of all people. He talked not just about civil rights, but he talked about economic rights, because he understood you couldn't have one without the other. But he also talked about the truth that our country tried over and over to convince its people that war was somehow a noble act. And Dr. King saw too many young black men sent off to their death in Vietnam. He saw too much of our national treasure spent killing. And he couldn't take it anymore. And a lot of people told him not to talk about the war. If you look at the history, you'll see clearly a lot of people counseled him that if he talked about the war, he would lose support, that somehow it would dilute his message. But Dr. King believed it was impossible to get to justice so long as the Vietnam War raged. In fact, how can you have justice and war at the same time? Think about it. Dr. King lived in a moment where he refused to ignore what was happening around him. Now, I want to say to all of you, we're living in another one of those moments. We have the endless wars that we've been experiencing now for decades in Iraq and Afghanistan. And now, this very moment, we could be on the verge of another even greater war with Iran. And doesn't it seem eerie to you that you turn on the television, you go online, and at any given hour it may feel like war is imminent, and then the next day it's as if nothing is happening at all? Isn't that strange? I saw something the other day that struck me. When President Trump ordered the killing of General Soleimani, it was the first time the United States of America had killed a foreign national military leader since World War II. And that was chilling to me as a reminder of what we may have entered into. Dr. King put his own life on the line when he spoke out against the Vietnam War. And in 1967, right here in New York City at Riverside Church, a speech known as Beyond Vietnam, he made explicitly clear we could not reach that fairer society if we did not stop the war. He made clear that the two could not go together. And I want you now to understand, because we all feel it, how many people in this room have a family member who served in Iraq or Afghanistan? Raise your hand. Raise your hand. And you know how many of our young people have been lost, how many young people were wounded and their lives will never be the same. I saw that with my own dad, who served in World War II, came back missing half a leg, came back with PTSD. His life was never the same. Our family was never the same. That is happening to tens and thousands of our young people now. We have lost over 6,000 young Americans in those wars. And on top of that, we have lost a chance to fix the profound challenges of our country. I'm going to tell you something, and the human lives are what matter most, but I want to tell you something about your money as well. $6.4 trillion have been spent on those forever wars. I asked people on my staff to check the number again. I said that couldn't be possible, but $6.4 trillion spent in our name. We weren't asked our opinion, were we? But it's spent in our name, $7,000 for every taxpayer in America. If we had kept that money, if we did not pursue war but pursued peace and used that money, it could have allowed us. Small fraction of that money could have allowed us to give pre-K to every child in America for free. Every child. A small fraction of that money could have stopped the rise of emissions that now threaten the future of our Earth. A small fraction of that money. That money could have paid for, this is how much money it is. That money could have paid to fix every road and bridge and subway and school and park in the United States of America, every single one of them. Dr. King said in another great speech at the National Cathedral in Washington in 1968, he said, "War plays havoc with our domestic destinies. Something must be done, and done quickly." He knew that in 1968, and he said in the same speech, "No one who has any concern for the integrity and life of America today can ignore the present war." So I bring this to you today because somehow, all the things that have been talked about in this country, somehow, the present war, the endless wars, get swept under the rug. And the war that is looming is one day in the news and the next day it's disappeared. I say this to you in the spirit of Dr. King, and I'll conclude with this point. There are so many things Dr. King said to us that instruct us. He did not just leave us ideas pertinent to his time, he gave us a roadmap for our times. When you read his words, they immediately tell you what we need to do. And he said in that Beyond Vietnam speech, he said, "A time comes when silence is betrayal." To all of you, all the good people here today, everyone who gathers here to reflect, to learn, to think, and then to recognize how you can act. Don't participate in that betrayal, is what I say. Don't ever be silent. And the good news is, New Yorkers, we are rarely silent, isn't that right? We are not good at silence, are we? New Yorkers stood up to stop and frisk, and we beat it. We ended it. New Yorkers stood up. That Women's March, Charlene talked about, 2017 and since, the largest demonstration in the history of the United States of America to defend the rights of women. We stood up. We are going to stand up now against the hate that has reared its head in so many communities. New Yorkers, speak up, stand up, and we must stand up against the gathering storm of this war. You know, in Vietnam, for so long, people thought the war could not be stopped, but they stood up, they spoke out. It was the people who stopped the Vietnam War. It was not the politicians, it was the people. It was the people who stopped that war. It is the people who must stop the next war. It is the people who must bring our troops home. It is the people who must save the lives of our fellow Americans and finally open the doors to a just society where all those resources are spent on fairness, on decency, on our children, on our families, on our neighborhoods. Don't ever be silent. Stand up. Thank you. God bless you all.